The sun poured golden light over the sprawling estate as the gates of the mansion slowly creaked open. A sleek black car rolled down the pristine driveway lined with trimmed hedges and imported marble statues. The grand house, more a palace than a home, stood like a monument to success, tall glass windows, arched balconies, and white columns glowing in the morning light. Inside, silence ruled, broken only by the occasional chirping of birds outside and the soft clicking of heels on polished marble. On the second floor, in a room filled with luxury, silk curtains, custom furniture, and shelves lined with books and golden trinkets, a young girl sat in a wheelchair by the window. She watched the world from behind the glass, her eyes tracing the clouds as they floated above the trees. Her name was Alina, the only daughter of a powerful film director known across the country for his box office hits, his wealth, and his ambition. Alina was 16 but looked older, not from age, but from the quiet sorrow in her eyes and the stillness of her body. She hadn't walked since she was 10. It began suddenly, a collapse in the schoolyard, followed by weeks of hospital visits, puzzled doctors, and ultimately, resignation. It's psychological, one expert had said. Maybe neurological, another argued. But none could offer a cure. Her legs refused to move, not from injury, but from something no one could name. They brought her the best therapists, healers, neurologists, even spiritual gurus. All failed. Over the years, her world shrank from the fields and playgrounds to the four corners of her bedroom. Outside her room, the mansion bustled quietly with staff who had learned not to disturb. Servants polished railings and arranged flowers. Meals were prepared and delivered like clockwork. Yet nothing touched the girl in the window. She had grown used to watching others move, running children, walking birds, the slow motion of clouds. Her fingers rested on the windowsill like roots, still, unmoving, but present. Her father, Roman Alexandrov, had once been a man of laughter and energy. But now, behind his expensive suits and powerful meetings, he carried a dull weight. He avoided her room more often now, not out of cruelty, but because her condition reminded him of the one thing in his life he couldn't control or fix. In public, he smiled, closed deals, made speeches. At home, he paced quietly outside her door, listening, helpless. Each morning, Alina was dressed by her nurse, her hair brushed into smooth waves, her breakfast served with ceremony, silver tray, porcelain cup, fruit carved like art. But the rituals meant little to her. She said little, smiled less, and lived as if she were a ghost in a golden cage. That morning was like any other. The nurse opened the windows slightly to let in the breeze. The light touched Alina's pale face as she stared at the garden below. A few gardeners moved among the roses, trimming, watering, pulling weeds. She noticed a new figure among them, a young man with rolled-up sleeves, dark skin browned by the sun, moving not with robotic efficiency but with gentle care. He paused to admire the flowers after watering them, as if listening to them breathe. Something about him caught her attention. She didn't know why, but he seemed different from the others. He wasn't just doing a job, he looked as if he belonged to the earth itself. As she watched, he turned suddenly and looked up, not directly at her window, but close enough that her breath caught in surprise. Their eyes didn't meet, but for a moment, it felt as if the invisible barrier between her world and the garden had cracked just a little. A knock came on the door. Her breakfast. The moment passed. The tray was placed before her, the same as always. Toast, fresh fruit, and warm tea. She picked at it slowly, her mind still drifting back to the man in the garden. She told herself it didn't matter. He was just a worker, another temporary face in a house filled with strangers. But something inside her, some small ember long buried, stirred. Just a flicker. And outside, the migrant worker, unaware of the silent eyes watching from above, moved to the next rosebush, humming softly as he worked, his hands careful, his presence humble. The day continued. But something, ever so slightly, had changed. The quiet corridors of the mansion were filled with echoes of absence. Beneath its marble floors and chandeliers, time seemed frozen, especially in the part of the house where Alina's room stood, sealed off like a forgotten wing of memory. But it was not only silence that lingered, it was defeat, the heavy kind that even wealth couldn't hide. Roman Alexandrov stood in his office, staring blankly at the wall. Tall shelves filled with awards and scripts surrounded him, but they seemed like trophies of a former life. A glass of untouched whiskey sat on the desk. He hadn't touched alcohol in years, but recently, the urge came more often. Not to forget the world, but to dull the ache of helplessness. A voice crackled through the intercom. "Dr. Serov is here, sir." He straightened his posture, adjusted his collar, and replied, "Send him in." Dr. Serov, a respected neurologist with a reputation for curing the incurable, entered with the air of cautious hope. His crisp white coat and confident stride suggested expertise, but Roman had seen dozens like him before. Each came with promises, left with excuses. They moved together toward Alina's room. As they approached, the nurse opened the door and gave a small, encouraging nod. Alina sat by the window, as always, her posture relaxed but distant. She didn't turn when they entered. Roman hesitated, then forced a warm tone. "Alina, this is Dr. Serov. He's highly recommended." She glanced briefly at the man, then returned her gaze to the garden. She said nothing. It was her usual response, detached politeness, just enough to acknowledge but never invite. The doctor kneeled beside her, speaking softly. He asked her to lift her foot. No response. He tapped her knees with a reflex hammer. Her muscles twitched, but she didn't react. He asked her questions. She gave minimal replies. He looked into her eyes, searching for signs, trauma, defiance, despair, but found only still water. No ripples. Just quiet. After 20 minutes, he stepped aside and spoke privately with Roman by the door. "She can feel. Her nervous system is intact," the doctor said in a lowered voice. "This is not physical paralysis. It's something deeper. Psychological, perhaps. But this level of resistance, it's rare. So, what do we do?" Roman asked, his voice sharp with restrained frustration. Dr. Serov hesitated. "She may not want to walk. Not yet. Something inside her has shut off that desire. Until that changes, we can only try gentle stimulation, therapy, patience." "I've given her 6 years of therapy," Roman said. 6 years of patience. "I understand," Serov said carefully. "But the human spirit doesn't respond to deadlines. It responds to meaning." Roman looked past the doctor, into the room where his daughter still sat unmoved. He felt the same helplessness flooding him again. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff and watching the ground slowly crumble. Dr. Serov offered a polite nod and left, saying they could try weekly sessions, but even that sounded hollow. Another file in a drawer. Another expert with no solution. Roman returned to his study, closing the door behind him with more force than he meant to. He stood in silence, staring at the awards again. Shiny lies, he thought. He had everything a man could want: fame, power, money. But none of it could lift his daughter out of that chair. In another part of the house, the staff whispered. The cook shook her head as she prepared lunch. The housekeeper sighed while folding fresh linens. They had all grown used to the cycle: new doctors, new methods, new failures. They pitied the girl but didn't know her. She rarely spoke. Her world was behind a glass wall. Alina returned to watching the garden. Her face showed little, but her hands tightened slightly on the windowsill. She had heard everything. She always did. They spoke in whispers, but whispers carried. They always thought she wasn't listening, but she heard it all. She just didn't respond. She knew her father was trying. She didn't hate him. But every doctor, every test, every hopeful voice that turned into disappointed silence had taken something from her. A belief, a connection, a reason. Outside, the same new worker moved slowly through the garden, now raking leaves. He stopped for a moment to help a small bird tangled in netting. She noticed. He freed it gently and let it fly. It was such a simple act, but her eyes followed it for a moment longer than usual. Then she looked away again. In that house of grandeur and sorrow, hope was a rare guest. And even when it knocked, no one rushed to answer the door anymore. The morning sun rose lazily over the Alexandrov estate, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the towering birch trees that bordered the garden, where a group of workers moved quietly, tending to their tasks. Among them was a new face, lean, sun-browned, dressed in worn clothes and carrying a simple canvas sack over his shoulder. His name was Yusuf, a migrant worker who had arrived in the city just weeks earlier, looking for any job that would help him send money home. He had heard of the Alexandrov family, everyone had. Stories of their wealth, their parties, the daughter who never walked. Gossip swirled in the markets and bus stations, but Yusuf paid little attention to rumor. He didn't come for stories. He came for work. The job was simple: help maintain the massive gardens, keep the fountains clean, trim the hedges. It didn't pay much, but it paid on time. His first day began before sunrise. The head gardener, a tired man with thinning hair, handed him a rake and a list of tasks. Do what's asked, don't talk to the family, and keep your head down, he instructed. Yusuf nodded silently. He wasn't one to talk much anyway. As he began his work near the southern rose garden, he noticed how quiet everything was. The kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, but heavy. The house loomed in the distance, grand and cold, its windows dark like watchful eyes. Occasionally, he'd hear footsteps or the distant hum of a car engine, but mostly, it was just birdsong and the soft crunch of gravel beneath his boots. He approached a patch of wild-growing ivy that had crept onto the garden walls and began pulling it back with careful hands. Every now and then, he would pause and look around, absorbing the silence. Unlike the noise of the city he had left behind, this place felt almost untouched, but not alive, not really. Beautiful, yes, but it was the kind of beauty that didn't invite anyone in. As the morning wore on, Yusuf moved closer to the side of the mansion where the upper rooms cast shadows onto the ground. While adjusting a water hose near a flower bed, something caught his attention. A faint flicker in the glass window above. He looked up, squinting into the light. There, barely visible behind a sheer curtain, was a girl. Her face pale, her body still, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the garden. She didn't move when he noticed her. She simply watched, not as if she were curious about him specifically, but as if she always watched, as if looking outside was her only connection to life beyond the walls. Yusuf blinked and looked away quickly. He wasn't supposed to look at the family, let alone acknowledge them. He returned to his work, pretending not to notice her again, though he could feel the weight of her gaze lingering. A few minutes later, when he dared another glance upward, the girl was gone from the window. He continued his chores, moving to the fountain at the center of the courtyard. As he scrubbed moss from its edge, he thought about the girl. There had been something in her eyes. Not just sadness. Loneliness, yes, but also distance, as though she were a part of the house, a piece of its frozen time. Later, during his short break, Yusuf sat beneath a tree and opened a small container of rice and beans he had brought from home. The other workers ate in silence nearby. None of them spoke of the girl or the family. No one mentioned the rumors, though everyone knew them. She hadn't walked in years, they said. Some believed it was a curse. Others thought she had lost her will after her mother died. No one really knew the truth. And no one dared ask. As Yusuf ate, he glanced once more toward the upper window. It was empty now, the curtain still. That night, after finishing his shift and walking back to his small rented room, Yusuf kept thinking about the girl in the window. Something in her expression had stayed with him, a flicker of life buried deep beneath layers of silence and years of stillness. He didn't know her name or her story. But somehow, he sensed that she was waiting. Not for a doctor. Not for a miracle. Just for someone to really see her. The following days passed in quiet repetition. Yusuf arrived each morning just after sunrise, stepping through the servant's entrance with his tools slung over his shoulder and a quiet determination in his eyes. He worked efficiently, never complaining, always thorough. The others began to take notice, not because he spoke much, but because he listened. When the fountain pump sputtered, he fixed it. When a section of the garden showed signs of disease, he quietly treated the soil without waiting for instruction. He became a presence, steady, invisible, necessary. But what no one else noticed was how often he glanced up at the second-floor window. Alina had resumed her silent vigil by the glass. Most days she sat still, her wheelchair angled just enough to catch the garden's light and its motion. The roses bloomed in bursts of crimson and white. The wind teased the trees gently. And among it all, she watched the same figure, the quiet worker who moved as if he belonged to the earth, not just to the job. He never looked directly at her again, but she knew he had seen her that first day. And now, something subtle passed between them, an unspoken awareness. On the fifth morning, Yusuf was trimming a line of hedges near the rosebush closest to her window when a small object bounced softly on the grass beside him. He looked down. A pencil. Old and worn, but sharpened. He picked it up slowly and glanced upward. Alina was there, her hand still slightly raised, the faintest trace of challenge in her expression. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But her eyes dared him to break the silence. Yusuf looked at the pencil, then at her, and gave the smallest nod, not of submission but of understanding. That afternoon, as he was carrying a stack of cut branches toward the compost area, he saw her again. This time, she was downstairs. It startled him. She had been wheeled onto the back patio by her nurse, placed carefully in the shade beneath the stone archway. Her gaze swept across the garden as it always did, but this time it landed directly on him. No curtain, no distance. He hesitated, unsure if he should bow his head, turn away, or keep walking. She spoke first. "You don't move like the others," she said, her voice barely louder than the breeze. Yusuf stopped. Her words surprised him, not just that she spoke, but the way she spoke, soft, direct, unafraid. "I'm sorry," he asked, unsure if she was truly addressing him. "The others, they rush," she said. "You don't." He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I try not to rush the things that grow," he said. Alina tilted her head slightly. It was the first time in a long time anyone had responded to her without pity or performance. No polite smiles, no hushed tones, no talking as if she were a broken doll. "What's your name?" she asked. "Yusuf," he said. "And yours?" "You already know." He nodded once. Of course he did. Everyone knew who she was. But this moment felt different, not between a servant and a rich girl, but between two people trying to find meaning in a place full of silence. There was a long pause. "You're not afraid to talk to me," she said finally. "No," Yusuf replied. "Should I be?" "No. But most people are." "I don't know you yet," he said simply. "So I don't know what to be afraid of." Something in that response cracked the shell around her a little. Her lips almost curved into a smile, but it faded before it formed. "You think I can be fixed?" she asked suddenly, the weight in her voice deeper now. Yusuf looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I don't think you're broken," he said. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It wasn't awkward. It was full of something rare, trust, maybe. Curiosity. The first thread of something new. The nurse appeared a few minutes later to wheel Alina back inside. She didn't protest, but as she was rolled away, she turned her head slightly, just enough to say without words, "Don't vanish." And Yusuf, left alone among the roses, bent back down to his work with a strange warmth in his chest. He hadn't planned to speak. But now he knew he would again. The air inside the mansion was unusually tense that morning. The staff moved with hushed voices and careful steps, glancing often toward the large windows that looked out onto the garden. Something had shifted, though no one could say exactly what. For the first time in years, Alina had asked to be wheeled outside, not just to the covered terrace, but into the sunlight, right into the garden, among the roses, where the scent of earth and blossoms mixed in the air. That alone was enough to set the household abuzz. But what truly startled them was who she asked to see. Yusuf stood near the eastern flower bed, brushing soil off his hands when he noticed her nurse pushing the wheelchair across the gravel path. Alina wore a light blue dress, simple but elegant, her hair braided and resting over one shoulder. She held her posture differently today, more alert, less sunken. Her eyes met his as they approached, calm but unreadable. The nurse halted a few feet away. Alina gave her a small nod, and the nurse stepped back, giving them space. "You came back," she said quietly. "I said I would," Yusuf replied, brushing his palms against his pants. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you believe people can change without being forced?" He paused. "Only if they want to." She nodded, as if she already knew that would be his answer. "I've had people try to force me to walk for years," she said. "Therapists, doctors, even my father. They all thought pressure would do the trick. It never worked. I didn't want to prove anything to them." "And now?" he asked gently. She looked away, her gaze drifting to the rose bushes, their petals shifting with the breeze. "I don't know," she said. "But when I talk to you, I don't feel like a project. I just feel seen." Yusuf didn't reply right away. He let the silence exist, not rushing to fill it. That, in itself, comforted her. Then she turned back to him, eyes steady. "Would you help me? I want to try something. But not with them watching. Not with their rules." Yusuf's brows lifted slightly. "Help you how?" She gripped the sides of her wheelchair. Her knuckles went white. I want to try to stand. He stepped closer, unsure for a moment if he'd heard her correctly. Are you certain? No, she admitted. But I want to try. I don't want my legs to define the rest of my life. Yusuf crouched beside her, his voice low. This isn't something to rush. It will hurt. It will take time. I've had nothing but time, she said, her voice sharp for the first time. And I've let it all waste away. Yusuf studied her face, the trembling strength behind her eyes, the desperation she masked with pride. He understood now, this wasn't about walking. It was about taking back control of her own body, her own story. Then let me try, he said. Behind them, a voice sliced through the air. What do you think you're doing? Roman's voice was low and dangerous, but his pace was fast, his anger barely restrained. He strode across the garden toward them, face flushed with disbelief. Yusuf stood slowly and stepped back, instinctively placing himself slightly in front of Alina. She asked me to help, Yusuf said carefully. You're a gardener, Roman snapped. A laborer. You think you can fix what a decade of doctors couldn't. I'm not trying to fix her, Yusuf replied. I'm trying to listen. Roman's eyes flicked to his daughter. Alina, this is absurd. No, it's not, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. You've spent years choosing people for me. I'm choosing now. You don't know him, Roman argued. He could hurt you. He's the first person who hasn't, she said. That stopped Roman for a beat. Yusuf didn't move. He didn't raise his voice or plead. He just waited, watching the tension pass between father and daughter like a storm held in the air. Roman's jaw clenched. He looked at Yusuf, then at Alina. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if the weight of all the years caught up to him in that moment. If anything happens to her. I understand, Yusuf said. Roman turned and walked away, leaving only the wind and the quiet. Yusuf looked down at Alina. Still want to try? She nodded. And in that still corner of the garden, shielded from the world's expectations, they began something small, but real. The morning light filtered gently through the leaves, casting scattered shadows across the garden path where Alina sat in her wheelchair. The air smelled of damp earth and roses in full bloom. It was quiet except for the chirping of birds and the rhythmic sound of Yusuf's footsteps as he approached, carrying a folded blanket and a short wooden stool he had brought from the gardener's shed. Alina watched him silently, a mix of nervousness and determination in her expression. Her hands trembled slightly on the armrests of her chair. She had asked for this, to try again, but differently. No sterile therapy rooms, no instructions barked by professionals in lab coats, no pitying smiles. Just her, Yusuf, and the garden she had once only watched through a pane of glass. Yusuf laid the blanket out on a soft patch of grass beneath a tall tree. He placed the stool beside it, then walked back to her. We'll start small, he said. Just sitting on the ground today. No standing. No pressure. I haven't sat on the ground in 6 years, Alina said, almost in a whisper. He smiled. Then let's make today the first. He knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. I'll lift you, only if you're ready. You tell me when. She nodded, gripping the arms of the chair. For a moment, she hesitated, fear tightening her chest. What if she couldn't do it? What if it all went wrong? But then Yusuf looked at her, not with pity or worry, but quiet trust. It steadied her. I'm ready, she said. With great care, Yusuf slid one arm behind her back and the other under her knees. She felt the strength in his body, not forceful, but secure, like he was made of earth and stone. Slowly, he lifted her from the chair and lowered her to the blanket, making sure she was comfortable, supported, and not in pain. She winced slightly as her muscles, long unused, stretched and shifted. But it wasn't unbearable. He sat beside her, letting the silence return. How do you feel? He asked. Strange, she admitted. Like my body's been asleep and is only now realizing it. He nodded. It's not just about movement. It's about memory. Muscles remember. So do fears. She looked down at her legs, extended in front of her. They looked thin, almost unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else. I don't know if they'll ever work again. Maybe they will, he said. Maybe they won't. But you're more than your legs, Alina. You're here. You chose to be here. She picked up a fallen leaf and turned it over in her hands. I thought about walking every day. I imagined it. But I didn't believe it anymore. Then you came. I didn't do anything special, Yusuf said, his voice low. You saw me, she replied. Really saw me. Not the chair, not the diagnosis, not the headlines. Just me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone, white with streaks of gray. When I was a boy, my mother gave me this, he said. She told me when I felt afraid, to hold it and remember that even stones change over time. Water smooths them. Time reshapes them. He placed the stone in her hand. She held it tightly. Thank you. Over the next hour, they talked little. Yusuf helped her gently shift her position a few times. He massaged her calves lightly, explaining how blood flow mattered, how inactivity didn't mean death, it meant delay. He taught her simple breathing exercises, small arm stretches, ways to reconnect with a body that had felt lost. And when the sun began to lower just slightly in the sky, casting gold across the garden, Alina leaned back on her hands and looked up through the branches above. I used to dream about climbing trees, she said suddenly. I'd sit in them for hours, high above everything. I felt free up there. You will again, Yusuf said. Even if you don't climb them. You'll feel that way again. She turned to him. You really believe that? I have to, he said. Because you're starting to believe it too. She smiled, small, fragile, but real. That evening, the nurses were surprised to find her sitting on the grass, refusing the wheelchair until Yusuf lifted her back into it. Her father watched from the window, torn between confusion and something deeper, harder to name. And for the first time in many years, Alina slept without waking from the same dream, the one where her legs wouldn't move and no one waited for her. Because now, someone did. The morning began like so many before it, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the Alexandrov mansion and a faint mist rising from the garden. But there was something different in the air, a sense of anticipation, unspoken yet palpable. The house staff felt it as they moved through their tasks with quieter footsteps. The roses seemed to bloom a little brighter, and even the trees swayed more gently in the breeze. It was as though the earth itself was holding its breath. In the garden, under the tall birch trees, Alina sat upright in her wheelchair, her face calm but focused. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore a simple white blouse and soft trousers instead of the usual dress. Her hands rested firmly on the arms of the chair. Beside her, Yusuf crouched near the grass, his eyes steady, his presence calm and rooted. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks, stretching, strengthening, relearning sensation, building trust. Every morning, Yusuf would help her feel the ground beneath her feet again, not just physically but emotionally. And today, she had said it clearly, without hesitation, I want to stand. Yusuf had said nothing for a moment, simply nodding. Now, as they both sat in silence, he looked at her once more. Are you ready? Alina didn't answer immediately. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and then nodded. Yes. With great care, Yusuf moved in front of her, adjusting the small wooden stool they had used during training. He extended his hands toward her. I'll help guide you, but you do the rest. Don't rush. Just breathe. Listen to your body. She placed her hands in his, her grip firm, her palms slightly damp with nervousness. Yusuf braced her arms gently, his feet grounded like the roots of a tree. Alina slowly shifted her weight forward, her legs trembling under the effort. Her toes pressed into the earth as if testing the idea of standing, unsure whether to trust the possibility. Her arms trembled, and her breathing quickened. For a moment, it felt like too much, the doubt, the fear, the memory of every failed attempt, every fall in front of strangers, every voice that had told her to try harder. Her knees began to shake. Yusuf saw it, felt it in her grip, but didn't speak. He only locked eyes with her, steady and sure. His silence was stronger than any encouragement could have been. I can't, she whispered, panic flashing in her eyes. Yes, you can, he said quietly. Not because you have to. Because you want to. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes again. And then, slowly, with a groan of effort and a tear slipping from the corner of her eye, she pushed down through her feet, leaned forward, and began to rise. Her legs wobbled, her entire body swayed like a sapling in the wind, but she stood. For the first time in 6 years, Alina Alexandrov was upright. Standing. No machines. No straps. No doctors holding her under the arms. Just Yusuf, his hands lightly on hers, not pulling, not lifting, only there. She let out a shaky breath and opened her eyes. She was taller than him now. Barely, but enough. Her gaze lifted slightly, and in it was disbelief, awe, and the unmistakable shimmer of joy. I'm standing, she said, her voice a breathless laugh. Yusuf smiled, not wide, but with deep warmth. You are. From the mansion's upper balcony, Roman stood frozen, having come out just in time to witness the moment. He gripped the railing tightly, his mouth slightly open, his expression unreadable. Years of pain and guilt hung in his eyes. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. All he could do was watch as his daughter stood under the trees, a girl transformed. A soft breeze caught Alina's hair as she slowly turned her face up to the sky. Her legs shook beneath her, muscles unaccustomed to bearing weight, but she stayed up. Her whole body ached, but she welcomed the pain. It was proof that she was alive in a way she hadn't felt for years. Then, gently, Yusuf helped guide her back down to sit on the stool, easing her slowly so she wouldn't fall. The moment passed, but the feeling didn't. Alina's hands rested in her lap, her heart pounding like a drum. She looked at Yusuf, her eyes full of gratitude and disbelief. I didn't think it would feel like this, she said. He nodded. Like you've returned to yourself. She smiled, this time fully. Exactly. And somewhere in the distance, a bird sang. The sky was painted with warm hues of gold and amber as the late afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon. The mansion stood quiet and still, the way it always had, but today the silence felt different. It wasn't hollow anymore. It wasn't heavy with grief or resignation. It was full of breath, of pause, of something returning that had long been lost. Hope had taken root in the soil of that garden, and it was beginning to grow. Inside the drawing room, Roman Alexandrov sat in his leather armchair, staring at nothing. His usually sharp and polished appearance was softer now. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up. On the table beside him sat a small photo of Alina as a child, her feet mid-air on a swing, laughing, untamed, free. He hadn't looked at that photo in years. Now, he couldn't stop. Footsteps echoed faintly on the marble floor, followed by the soft creak of the door. He looked up. Alina entered, not in her wheelchair, but walking slowly with Yusuf at her side. Her hand gripped his arm for balance, but her steps were her own. Each movement was careful, her legs still shaky, but her eyes glowed with something fierce and alive. Her dress swayed lightly with each step, and her chin was lifted, not defiantly, but with a quiet pride that made Roman's throat tighten. He rose from his chair, stunned into silence. For a long moment, he just stared at her, unable to speak. She stopped a few feet away, her weight still partly supported by Yusuf. Then she let go of him, standing on her own, her legs trembling but holding. Roman took a step forward, his voice catching. Alina. She nodded, smiling faintly. I told you. I just needed to do it my way. His eyes welled with tears. I didn't know how to help you. I know, she said softly. But sometimes, help isn't about doing something. It's about stepping back. He looked at Yusuf, then at her again. You stood in the garden. I saw you. I didn't believe it at first. I didn't believe it at first either, she said with a laugh. But he did. Yusuf shifted slightly, his usual quiet presence still calm and grounded, but there was a light in his eyes too, something more than pride. Gratitude. Reverence. He didn't speak, just nodded respectfully and stepped back, giving them space. Roman approached Alina slowly, afraid that if he moved too quickly, the moment would vanish. When he was close enough, he opened his arms. She hesitated only a second before stepping into his embrace. He held her gently at first, as if afraid of hurting her, but then pulled her tighter, years of pain and regret spilling into the silence. His shoulders trembled. I'm sorry, he whispered. For pushing too hard. For trying to control everything. You did what you thought was best, she replied. But what I needed, was to be heard. He pulled back just enough to look at her. And he heard you. She nodded. He saw me when no one else did. Roman turned to Yusuf, who stood near the wall, as humble and still as ever. For a long time, the two men just looked at each other. There was no need for words at first. Roman walked over slowly, extending his hand. Thank you, he said simply. Yusuf took his hand, his grip firm but respectful. She did the work. I just stood beside her. Roman gave a small, broken laugh. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do. They stood in quiet understanding, the three of them bound by something stronger than circumstance, transformation, and the courage that made it possible. Later that evening, the household gathered by the windows to watch as Alina took her first independent steps across the garden path. No one said anything, but a few wiped away tears. The whispers that once carried rumors now carried awe. The girl who had once been hidden behind windows now moved beneath the open sky. The next morning, Alina didn't ask to be wheeled to the garden. She walked there herself, slowly, with Yusuf waiting by the tree where it had all begun. She sat on the blanket, legs folded beneath her, sunlight dancing on her skin. For the first time in years, she didn't watch the world move from a distance, she was part of it. And the mansion, once cold and quiet, felt like a home again.